The great chamber of the Galactic Council was silent in a way no one had ever recorded before. Thousands of delegates sat frozen beneath the glowing star map, watching the last human defense fleet fade into nothing. Earth's signal went dark. Human space was officially conquered. The Galaxy Empire had won, and yet no one celebrated, because the silence felt wrong, heavy, and watching. The Empire's admirals stood tall, their armor shining under white council lights, waiting for cheers that never came. They had crushed stronger enemies before, burned worlds without regret, yet something about humanity's end left a bitter taste. The humans had fought like cornered beasts, stubborn to the last ship, the last station, the last breath. Across the chamber, the surviving species whispered among themselves. They remembered the human broadcasts, the calm voices saying goodbye, the strange final message sent to the galaxy. It had not been a threat, nor a plea. It was a single sentence, spoken softly, as if meant only for those who understood history. The doors of the council chamber opened without warning. Guards turned, weapons raised, sensors flaring in shock. A lone human walked inside. No armor, no escort. Just a simple dark suit, worn and burned at the edges. His hair was gray, his face tired, but his eyes were steady, almost peaceful. Murmurs spread like fire. Humans were not supposed to be here. Their leaders were dead or captured. Their fleets were gone. Yet this one walked slowly across the polished floor as if he owned the place. Each step echoed louder than the guns that had ended the war, and every alien eye followed him. The human stopped at the center of the chamber. He did not bow, did not kneel. He looked up at the towering Empire banners and then at the council seats filled with conquerors. His expression showed no fear, only quiet focus, as if this moment had been planned long ago. An Empire official finally spoke, his voice sharp with anger. He demanded to know how the human had entered, how he dared stand before his betters. The human listened patiently, hands folded behind his back. When the shouting ended, he spoke in clear, simple words that carried across the chamber. He said he was not there to surrender. That word seemed to confuse the translators. Several delegates laughed, sharp and nervous. The human waited for the sound to fade. He said he was there to remind the council of something they had forgotten, something humans learned before they ever reached the stars. The Empire leader leaned forward, eyes cold, and asked what rule could matter now that humanity was finished. The human smiled faintly, not in pride, but in memory. He said humans had a rule about victory, about what happens when someone believes they have truly won. The chamber grew quieter than before. Even the machines stopped humming. The humans spoke of old wars on Earth, of empires that crushed cities and claimed total control, only to fall years later to shadows, ideas, and time. He said humans never fear losing battles, only losing the chance to fight back. Some delegates shifted uncomfortably. Reports began to arrive on private screens. Trade lanes flickered. Communications lagged. The Empire leader ordered silence, but doubt had already entered the room. The human noticed. He raised his head slightly, his voice calm and steady. He said the war had ended exactly as humanity expected. He said the Empire had followed every move, every strategy humans predicted. By winning completely, by leaving nothing standing, the Empire had stepped into the oldest human rule of all. Never corner a species that learns from pain. The human took a slow breath and looked around the chamber one last time. He said this meeting was not the end of the war, but the beginning of its consequences. Then he asked a single question, quiet but sharp, one that echoed inside every mind present. He asked them if they truly believed humanity would ever fight without a final plan. The council chamber did not erupt into chaos as the Empire leaders expected. Instead, it fell into a deeper, sharper silence, the kind that follows a sound too important to ignore. The human diplomat remained standing at the center, calm amid growing confusion. While dozens of alien species studied him with new eyes, he had not threatened them. He had not begged. He'd simply stated that the war had ended exactly as humanity planned, and that idea disturbed them more than any weapon ever could. The Empire's Supreme Counselor finally rose, his towering form casting a long shadow over the human. He dismissed the words as arrogance from a defeated species, declaring that humanity no longer had fleets, worlds, or allies. The human listened without interruption, his face unreadable. When the counselor finished, the human replied softly that power was never about ships alone. He explained that humans had spent most of their history weaker than their enemies, smaller, divided, and outnumbered. Survival had forced them to study something far more dangerous than strength. He spoke of patterns, of empires that grew too fast, conquered too much, and assumed obedience would last forever. Humans, he said, learned early that control built on fear always collapses from the inside. They learned to watch trade, culture, belief, and patience. While the Galaxy Empire studied weapons and fleets, humans studied time. The idea unsettled the chamber, especially as more data alerts began quietly flashing across council desks. Several allied species requested permission to speak, but the Empire denied them, sensing weakness spreading. The human noticed this too, explained that humanity's rule was not written in books or treaties, it was taught through loss. Every time humans were defeated, they asked not how they lost, but why their enemy believed the fight was finished. The Empire had made the same mistake every human conqueror had made before. A sudden interruption rippled through the chamber as an aide rushed to whisper into the Empire counselor's ear. Trade disputes were breaking out across border systems. Protectorate worlds were delaying shipments, demanding explanations, citing human precedents for autonomy. The Empire dismissed it as coincidence. The human gently corrected them. He said humans had spent decades sharing ideas, systems, and knowledge with younger species, not as rulers, but as partners. Those ideas did not vanish when human fleets burned. The human took a slow step forward, his voice still measured. He explained that humans believed no empire should be unchallenged, not because they loved war, but because stagnation killed civilizations faster than enemies. He said humans never wanted to rule the galaxy. They only wanted to make sure no single power ever could. The council chamber felt smaller as that truth settled in. Another report arrived, this time impossible to ignore. A major empire-controlled world had halted resource exports, citing internal unrest and calls for reform inspired by human governance models. The human diplomat did not smile. There was no joy in his eyes, only certainty. He said the empire had won the war, but humanity had already begun the next phase long before the first battle ended. The Empire Counselor accused the human of manipulation, of poisoning the galaxy with dangerous ideas. The human agreed without hesitation, said ideas were humanity's most effective weapon because they could not be bombed, blocked, or erased. He reminded them that humans had shared those ideas freely, even with the Empire, trusting they would be studied. The Empire had ignored them, just as they ignored the rule. As tension tightened the air, the human delivered the core truth with quiet force. Humanity never fights to stand on top of ruins. It fights to make sure its enemy cannot stand comfortably afterward. The war had stripped humans of territory, but it had exposed the Empire's greatest weakness, dependence on obedience. The moment fear cracked, the structure would follow. The human ended his words by stating that this was not revenge, it was balance. Humanity believed the galaxy functioned best when no one felt untouchable, said the Empire still had a choice, but that choice was shrinking with every minute they delayed. Around the chamber, alien leaders no longer looked at the human as a defeated representative. They looked at him as a reminder of something they had failed to learn. And as the council recessed in uneasy disorder, one terrifying thought echoed across every imperial mind. The humans had lost the war, and yet they were still in control of how it ended. The council reconvened under pressure that could be felt even through reinforced walls and vacuum-shielded windows. News streams no longer came in as controlled reports, but as floods of alarms, delays, and unanswered commands. The human diplomat stood where he had been left, unmoving, as if time itself waited on his patience. The Empire's leaders returned to their seats with forced authority, but their posture had changed. Victory no longer sat comfortably on their shoulders. The human spoke again, explaining that humans had learned a harsh truth long before spaceflight. The moment an enemy believes the war is finished is the moment they stop defending against consequences. He revealed that humanity's greatest strength was never industry or fleets, but preparation for loss. Every human system, alliance, and trade route had been designed with the expectation of destruction. When the Empire shattered human space, it activated thousands of quiet failsafes spread across the galaxy. Independent systems began shifting policies. AI governance models seeded by humans activated autonomy clauses. Legal frameworks the Empire once mocked now gave smaller species justification to resist. None of it was illegal. None of it was violent. It was simply unstoppable. The Empire demanded to know how such influence had spread unnoticed. The human answered simply that humans listened more than they spoke. They traded ideas instead of orders. They shared tools instead of chains. Over time, species learned to rely less on the Empire and more on themselves. The Empire mistook that for loyalty. Human corrected them. It was independence waiting for permission. Now that permission had arrived in the form of imperial overreach. Reports confirmed the truth. Border fleets hesitated to move without local approval. Supply commanders questioned orders that endangered their own populations. Once loyal governors demanded concessions using human-style negotiation terms. The Empire tried to issue threats, but threats required credibility, and credibility required control. Control was already slipping. Human did not celebrate this collapse. He explained that collapse was never the goal. Exposure was. He told them the rule plainly at last. Humans never destroy an enemy at its strongest. They encourage it to overextend, to prove its dominance, to convince itself it has already won. Only then does it reveal how fragile that dominance truly is. The Empire had conquered humanity so completely that it no longer needed to understand it. That was the trap. The chamber filled with a realization more terrifying than defeat. Humanity had not lost to survive. It had lost to teach. And now the lesson was spreading faster than any fleet ever could. The first official fracture appeared not as rebellion, but as hesitation. Orders sent from the Imperial Corps began returning with polite delays, requests for clarification, and demands for guarantees. Entire fleets waited in formation while local commanders asked questions they had never dared ask before. The Empire had always ruled through certainty, through the belief that its will was final. Now that belief was weakening. The human diplomat watched the change ripple outward like cracks spreading across glass that still pretended to be solid. Inside the council chamber, the Empire leaders argued among themselves. Their voices sharp and layered with fear they could not fully hide. Some demanded immediate force, total suppression across all systems showing doubt. Others warned that such action would confirm the very ideas humans had planted. The humans said nothing during this chaos. He stood still, knowing that moments like this did not need pushing. They needed space to collapse under their own weight. New reports arrived faster than translators could process them. One protectorate world refused to pay tribute, citing economic survival. Another announced a public council election, openly inspired by human governance models shared years earlier. Merchant guilds began rerouting trade away from imperial hubs, not as protest, but as efficiency. The Empire tried to respond, but every command required enforcement, and enforcement required trust. Trust was evaporating. The human finally spoke again, his voice low but clear, cutting through the noise. Explained that humans understood systems because they lived inside broken ones for most of their history. They learned that control based on fear demanded constant pressure, constant force, constant proof. The moment that pressure eased, even for a breath, people remembered they had choices. The Empire had ruled too many species for too long to remember that truth. An Imperial intelligence officer accused the human of engineering collapse through sabotage. The human corrected him calmly, said humans never needed sabotage when incentives worked better. Every species within the Empire had its own needs, its own fears, its own dreams. Humans simply showed them that obedience was not the only path to survival. The Empire had done the rest by proving it could not protect everyone at once. As the debate grew more desperate, a message arrived that changed the tone of the room entirely. A major Imperial shipyard had stopped production, not due to attack but due to a labor withdrawal supported by 3 non-human species working together. They demanded safer conditions, shared leadership, and local authority. The shipyard's commanders requested permission to negotiate. Permission was denied. The workers did not return. The human closed his eyes briefly, as if acknowledging a long-expected outcome. Said this was the stage every empire feared, but never prepared for. When power fragments, violence no longer solves the problem. Violence only accelerates it. Every harsh response would create 10 quiet resistances. Every execution would birth 1,000 silent observers waiting their turn. The Empire Counselor demanded to know what humanity wanted now: territory, reparations, revenge? The human opened his eyes and met the counselor's gaze. He said humanity wanted the same thing it had always wanted. A galaxy where no single voice could end a species. Where defeat did not mean extinction. Where power was questioned, not worshipped. He said humans had learned this lesson by nearly destroying themselves more than once. The chamber felt smaller as the realization spread. This was not a negotiation for surrender terms. It was a confrontation with a philosophy the Empire could not crush. Outside the chamber, systems continued to drift away. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. The Empire still stood. Its fleets were still unmatched. But its foundation was no longer unquestioned. The human delivered one final warning in this session, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. Empires did not fall when they were weak. They fell when they refused to change while still strong. He said the cracks forming now could either become controlled reforms or uncontrollable collapse. Humanity would not decide which path the Empire chose. The Empire would, as the Council adjourned once more, fear followed them out of the chamber like a shadow that could no longer be ignored. The human diplomat remained behind, alone under the fading glow of the star map, fully aware that the most dangerous phase had begun, not war, not victory, but awakening. The council chamber opened again, but this time without ceremony. No banners glowed, no victory symbols remained. The Empire's leaders arrived quietly, carrying the weight of reports that no longer fit their old understanding of control. Across dozens of systems, compliance had turned into discussion, and discussion into refusal. The war was over, yet authority was slipping faster than during any battle. The human diplomat was already there. He had not moved since the last session, as if leaving would suggest impatience. His calm presence now felt heavier than armed guards. Several council members avoided his eyes. They had reviewed the data, the economic shifts, the coordinated pauses across species once divided by fear. None of it could be traced back to violence. The Empire Counselor spoke first, his voice stripped of arrogance. He asked how far this would go. How many systems would drift away before the humans were satisfied? The human answered that satisfaction had nothing to do with it. Humans did not measure success by how much they took, but by how much blood they prevented from being spilled after victory. He explained that this was the rule humans lived by. Always leave a door open. Not for mercy, but for stability. When enemies were crushed without options, they became legends, martyrs, and long wars. When enemies were given a choice, history moved forward. Humanity had learned this after nearly ending itself on its own world. A general demanded to know what choice the Empire had left. Fleets were still loyal. Weapons still worked. The human nodded and agreed. The Empire could still enforce control through force, but humans knew what followed. Occupation bred resistance. Resistance demanded escalation. Escalation ended empires even when they won every battle. The humans spoke of a future that could still exist, like shared governance councils, trade agreements not backed by threat. Systems allowed internal rule under mutual defense. The Empire would remain powerful, but no longer absolute. Humans had offered this path before the war. It had been rejected as weakness. A council member from a client species finally spoke, breaking protocol. He said his people had never wanted rebellion. They only wanted dignity. The room froze. The Empire did not silence him. That silence mattered more than any speech. The human watched carefully. The choice had begun forming without his push. The counselor asked what humanity demanded in return. The human answered simply, recognition. Acknowledgement that humanity's defeat did not mean irrelevance. Seat in rebuilding discussions. Protection for remaining human worlds. Not dominance. Participation. The Empire struggled with that word more than any threat. Outside the chamber, news arrived that 3 more sectors had paused imperial tax transfers. Not defiance, negotiation. The Empire realized something terrifying. The galaxy was no longer asking permission. It was waiting for an answer. The human ended with a final truth. Humans were dangerous not because they destroyed enemies, but because they survived them. Every empire that had ignored this rule had eventually learned it the hard way. This was the last moment to learn it peacefully. The chamber adjourned without a vote, but the Empire knew. The war had ended long ago. This decision would define whether it survived what came after. The final session of the Galactic Council did not feel like an ending. It felt like exhaustion given form. The Empire's leaders arrived slower than before, their movements heavy, their confidence drained by days of reports that all told the same story. No fleets had mutinied. No worlds had declared open war. Instead, the galaxy had simply stopped behaving the way the Empire expected. Systems negotiated instead of obeyed. Allies requested guarantees instead of issuing praise. Control had not shattered, it had thinned. The human diplomat stood as he always had, quiet and patient. But this time the council did not see him as a defeated representative. They saw him as a mirror. In him, they saw every empire that came before them, every ruler who believed strength alone could hold forever. The Empire Counselor spoke slowly, choosing each word with care, and admitted what no imperial voice had said before. The Empire had underestimated the meaning of survival. He asked the human to restate the rule, not as warning, but as record. The human complied. He said the rule was simple and cruel in its honesty. Never push humanity into a corner without an exit. Humans adapt fastest when they are wounded, not when they are winning. When denied space, they create it. Denied power, they redistribute it. Denied victory, they redefine what victory means. Silence followed, but it was different now. It was not fear of hidden weapons or unseen fleets. It was the fear of understanding too late. The Empire had crushed humanity's military strength, but in doing so had validated every lesson humans had learned through centuries of struggle. Humans had not resisted collapse. They had prepared for it. That preparation was now shaping the galaxy. The Empire Counselor announced the decision. Reforms would begin immediately. Client systems would gain internal authority. Trade enforcement would shift from threat to contract. A new interspecies council would form, and humanity would hold a permanent seat. It was not surrender, it was survival through change. The Empire chose adaptation over pride. The human listened, then nodded once. He did not celebrate. He did not smile. He said that humanity accepted, not because the Empire had finally understood humans, but because it had begun to understand itself. That mattered more. He reminded them that humans never wanted to rule the galaxy. They wanted to live in one where defeat did not mean extinction. As the agreement was sealed, reports confirmed what the human already knew. Systems that had paused obedience began resuming cooperation, not out of fear, but cautious hope. Markets stabilized, fleets stood down, the galaxy exhaled. The disaster everyone had felt approaching quietly stepped aside. The human turned to leave without ceremony. No guards stopped him. No voices challenged him. As he walked toward the exit, the Empire Counselor asked one final question. Why humans always offered a choice instead of punishment. The human answered without turning around. Because punishment ends stories, he said. Choices create futures. The doors closed behind him, and for the first time in its history, the Galactic Council understood the rule it had forgotten. Humanity was not dangerous because it won wars. Humanity was dangerous because it endured them, learned from them, and reshaped the aftermath. The galaxy would never forget that again.